Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, I'm Dr. Ben Weitz, and thank you for joining our functional medicine discussion group meeting tonight. And we are very honored to be joined by Dr. Joe Pizzorno, who will be speaking with us about environmental toxins. I hope you'll consider joining some of our other upcoming meetings, including November 18th with Dr. Peter Pizzorno on an integrative approach to depression and anxiety. I encourage everybody to participate in discussion by typing your questions into the chat box. And if you are not aware, we have a closed Facebook page, the Functional Medicine Discussion Group of Santa Monica. So you should join so we can continue the conversation. I am recording this event and I'll post it on my YouTube page, included in my weekly Rational Wellness Podcast. And if you have not listened to it, please check out the Rational Wellness Podcast and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoy listening to this, please go to Apple Podcasts and give me a ratings and review. And now I want to thank our sponsor for this evening, Integrative Therapeutics. And so Integrative Therapeutics is one of the few professional brands of supplements that we carry in our office, and they have a number of products that can be helpful in detoxifying toxins. Dr. Joseph Pizzorno is one of the most important naturopathic doctors, educators, researchers, and one of the founding members of the functional medicine movement. Dr. Pizzorno has written or co-authored more than 12 books, including the Encyclopedia of Natural Medicine, which has now sold over 2 million copies. And I dare say almost everybody who's involved in the world of natural medicine has a copy of that book in their bookshelf. The Textbook of Natural Medicine for the Prevention and Treatment of Cancer, the Toxin Solution, Clinical Environmental Medicine, and his newest book, written with his wife, Lara Pizzorno, Healthy Bones, Healthy You. And now we're honored to be joined by Dr. Pizzorno. Unfortunately, I didn't record the first couple of minutes of the discussion, so we're going to jump right into this conversation with Dr. Joe Pizzorno.
The thing about the GTT, which is so interesting, is, it was one of the enzymes we used to be as a standard measure for hepatitis, because when the liver gets damaged, starts leaking liver enzymes in, and high liver enzymes means hepatitis of some sort. So they stopped doing GTT because it just wasn't as good and not necessary. But the technology is all there. It's a cheap test. What's interesting about it, when you think about it's leaking an enzyme into the blood, what's that enzyme doing? Well, that enzyme recycles glutathione. And so our smart bodies, when we're exposed to toxic load, starts recycling glutathione faster as a way to protect ourselves from the toxic load. So it's a nice indirect measure. And so not only does it indirectly correlate with directly correlate with toxic load, it also directly correlates with many diseases, particularly diabetes, but also risk of death. Okay. So the normal range, depending upon the lab, is 10 to 60 or 10 to 50. It's just in that range. And women tend to be a little lower than men. Anyway, so anything in that range is considered okay. So the average for this particular group of people was about 30. Now you might say, well, that's fine. But a GTTP of 30 carries with it an 8-fold increased risk for diabetes. So as you might expect, I found a lot of insulin resistance in this particular group of people. By the way, they were mainly supposedly healthy men aged about 30 to 50. Most of them were in that group, but we have some office workers and some women. Okay. So not people who expect to have a lot of disease. So I'm trying to figure out why do they have these high GTTs? And I started talking to them. So one of the things we did was not only to get the people the advice, but then they fly us out into the field to meet with them. So we had one-to-one interactions with the real people we're working with, not just numbers from a laboratory. So it was a really good experience. So I learned that a big chunk of them were working in the oil fields as a way to subsidize the family farms, which weren't commercially viable anymore because of mega farming. So what do you think they were doing on their farms to compete with the mega farmers?
Herbicides and pesticides.
All those herbicides and pesticides you heard.
Yes.
I had this group of people with clearly going in the direction of diabetes because of all these herbicides and pesticides. So I said, well, that's interesting. So then I started, I forgot, maybe that article came out 5 years ago. I then started diving into the research, just look at, well, what are the correlations with these various environmental toxins and incidence of disease? And the first one I looked at was diabetes, because I don't know, I see some more gray hairs in here like myself, but when I was in private practice way back in the 70s, you didn't see a diabetic patient. I mean, I remember so obviously I'm a bright guy. I was fully booked all the time. I didn't see my first diabetic patient until I was in practice for 6 months of full-time practice. They just weren't that common. And now, 10% of people are diabetic and 1/3 will become diabetic. What happened? Well, we didn't change our genetics. And you might say, well, how about people that eat too much sugar? Yes, people eat too much sugar. There's no correlation between sugar epidemic consumption and the diabetes epidemic. Although maybe the high fructose corn syrup might contribute. I'm looking at that as another environmental toxin I should consider. But what does correlate with diabetes is the level of herbicides, the level of pesticides, the level of bisphenols, the levels of phthalates, and things like that. So then I got a group of pretty bright bastard grads to help me answer the question: if we can determine how much a particular toxin is increasing risk of disease, if we know what the portion of that toxin is in the general population, can we figure out what percent of that disease is due to that toxin? And we did that. And by the way, we weren't making it up. There's the standard public health policy or public health math that used for figuring that all out. We did all the standard stuff, all tele-referenced. And here's I could tell 90% of the diabetes epidemic was due to environmental toxins. Okay, and that's why the researchers call them diabetogens.
And which were the most significant diabetogens?
So big surprises here: PCBs, phthalates, arsenic. Arsenic. Is everybody aware that 1/3 of the U.S. population has arsenic levels that are high enough to cause disease? 1/3.
Wow.
Okay, and that's the whole population. Wow. You can probably assume most people in your offices are going to have too much arsenic. Okay, so I'm going to go for. So first off, so the basic idea number one is, wow, we have an incredibly toxic environment, and it is really poisoning people. And it is the primary cause of chronic disease right now. Oh, and by the way, you might be saying, wait a minute, we all know obese people have way more diabetes than non-obese people. It's very true. Here's the kicker. This is work done by Dr. Lee in South Korea. If you look at the amount of environmental diabetogens in their fat stores, and then you compare them to diabetes, it turns out those obese people with low levels of obesogens don't have increased risk for diabetes. It's not the fat, it's what's in the fat that's causing trouble. And there's some people even hypothesize that some people are unconsciously overweight as a way of diluting these environmental toxins, because not only are they calling them diabetogens, they're calling them obesogens. So, for example, there's a direct correlation between bisphenol A levels and a person's body weight, both men and women. Are y'all? Is this stuff everybody knows? I'm just, or is it interesting? I need feedback.
Very interesting. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, we're just listening to you, so we're enjoying it.
By the way, I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but what's the best way to test for heavy metals like arsenic?
Okay, so let me talk about arsenic for a second, and I'll answer that question at the end. Okay. Kind of give you an inducement for following me for a few seconds. Okay, so
we'll follow you as long as you want to speak to us.
Oh, thanks. Well, okay, thanks. Anyway, so one of the things I was wondering about is, okay, everybody's kind of getting really excited about lead toxicity. They did that quite some time ago, and the good news is we've decreased the biload of lead. So congratulations to us. But nobody's paying attention to arsenic. And it turns out, look like arsenic is actually worse than lead. So I'm working on a project right now in Flint, Michigan, where I wanted to bring natural medicine to an underserved population. I was tired of all the politics. I said, I don't know about the politics, but I do know how to help people be healthy. And there's a group of people everybody knows about needs help because there's a lead problem. I said, let me go in and see if I can help out. So here's what's really fascinating. They have a bigger arsenic problem than they have lead problem, and nobody knows it. So we got a sample from the state of the actual measurements of the drinking water people were drinking, 43% of them were above 10 micrograms per liter of 10 micrograms of arsenic per liter of water. That's the standard threshold is 10. And by the way, I'm giving a lecture tomorrow on the latest research on arsenic for AHIM. That's Academy of Integrated Health Medicine. It's going to start tomorrow, but if you haven't done it, I suggest you consider it. I'm going to lecture tomorrow on the latest arsenic research. I'm going to be making a really strong case that it has to be 7. Okay, but just using 10 as a cutoff. Okay, 43% of them were above that cutoff. So I was wondering, so if there's so much arsenic and 35% of the U.S. population is above 10 micrograms per liter of urine, which is the arsenic cutoff, if it's that much, why aren't people paying more attention to it? So I'm curious, did any of you hear my lecture on unimportant molecules at this year's IFM? I'm just curious if anybody heard that lecture.
No.
Okay. I'm not hearing about so much yet.
I did.
Let me tell you what my thesis was. So my thesis was that the research we did 100 years ago to determine what nutrients were necessary for health was limited to the research techniques and technology that was available at the time and our understanding of physiology and of medicine. So we pretty much had to do primarily animal studies, and we had to look at what made them die or live or not suffer some really severe disease, and to figure out these vitamins and minerals necessary for health, and amino acids and fat acids, things like that. Add them all together, it's about 43 molecules or 42 molecules. Somebody correct my math on that one. So I'll go with 42 for now. Okay, and sometimes there's obligate needs, and add 2 or 3 or 4, maybe even 5. Okay, but it's a small number. The next question then is though, well, have you ever thought how many molecules are there in food? We started looking at how many molecules in food, and it looks like around 50,000. So we decided that 0.1% of the food supply was important and everything else wasn't important. Now, guess what happens when you grow foods chemically? Now, they call it conventional growing. Let's just call it what it is. It's chemically growing foods. When you grow foods chemically, you manage to almost maintain the vitamins and known minerals, but when you then look at those other molecules, they're either dramatically lower or they're gone. So I was thinking, well, that's interesting. So one of the fun things about being associated with Bastyr is I sometimes get students say, hey, Dr. Pizzorno, can I work with you on something? So I said, yeah, I've got this idea. So I'm wondering why it looks like we're seeing more arsenic toxicity now than we did in the past. And I'm also noticing that we have less flavonoids in the diet than we had in the past. Would you look and see if there's any use of flavonoids in protecting us from arsenic? And guess what? She did. So it's a situation, not only are we adding toxins to the environment, we're removing many of our protective mechanisms without realizing it. So for example, I've got the study that shows 1/4 to 1/3 of all cancers is due to, or are due to, is or are, whatever, whichever, arsenic. It turns out the more arsenic a person has, the more cancer they have. 1/4 to 1/3 of the major cancers that kill people are arsenic. And guess what one of the flavonoids called flortin does? It helps protect the DNA from the arsenic damage that leads to cancer. And if you look at the dietary consumption of that, it's decreased dramatically. There's a study done with tomatoes where they grew tomatoes chemically and they grow tomatoes organically. And organic tomatoes had 10 times as much of the flortin than the chemically grown tomatoes. They had just enough of the flavonoids to keep enough of their color. People recognize they're a right food, enough of the taste. But all the other stuff is gone. Okay, so that's my thesis for today.
So now where's the arsenic? Where's it coming from? How is it getting into the water?
So there are 2 primary sources. There was a third one in the past, but that seems to have stopped. Number one is it naturally occurs in many water supplies. Okay, so it turns out we humans are actually pretty good to get rid of arsenic. Half-life of arsenic in the body is only 2 to 4 days. So as we evolved as a species, we came across arsenic and we're good and get rid of it, okay? The problem is you're sitting in one place and that one place has arsenic in the water, guess what? Now you overload the systems, now you start seeing all this disease pop up, okay? So traditionally, the water supply is primary, but there's 2 problems that have also happened. Number one is we have had a fair amount of industrial exposure, and that somewhat, to some degree, continues to happen, but it's been decreased, but we have intentionally put arsenic compounds throughout our environment. So remember those old wooden climbing toys? They use arsenic compounds to keep them from rotting. And how about those? Remember that the gypsy moth scare problem when they're spraying the environment? Guess what they're spraying the environment with? It was an arsenical compound. Okay. So we have intentionally put in a lot of arsenical compounds into the environment. So the environment is really quite contaminated.
Right. And they used to feed it to chickens as well, right?
You can use feed it to chickens. And actually, I was looking at I was just looking at some research on that, and it does look like the arsenic levels of chicken have gone down. Now, they're not gone, but it looked from one study, and I'm not going to bet the farm on this, as they say. I saw one study that said it's 50% lower now than it was 2015.
Now, why would they feed arsenic to chickens?
Oh, because it's we maybe have a farmer here who can tell us more about it, but my understanding is they give it to them to kill off the parasites and also makes them plumper.
How is bottled water?
I don't have any information on that. Can't answer that. So what do people think about my idea? I mean, it looks to me like we're having so much disease. I mean, realize we have the highest burden of chronic disease in every age group ever in human history. It looks to me like it's not just the environmental toxins. We've removed a bunch of protective mechanisms, which make these environmental toxins even more important, because when we use our natural medicines, if their systems are already poisoned, it's hard for natural medicines to work. I'm sorry, I'll stop talking. What do people think?
What's the best way to test for heavy metals like arsenic?
So arsenic is not a heavy metal. It's technically called a metalloid. And the thing with that is all you need to do is get, the standard is the first morning urine, but they have to be in their normal environment. So you can't have, for example, I live in Seattle, you can't have somebody who's working on a farm in Eastern Washington where there's arsenic and contamination, decides to come to the big city to see this naturopathic doctor. And while he's here, they go and have go for a movie and go for dinner, et cetera, et cetera. By the time he sees me, he's been here for 2 or 3 days. Well, most of the arsenic's gone, so it won't show up. So it's got to be fresh in the real environment. You can use toenail arsenic. It's a little trickier. That's all.
So urine is preferred.
What do you think about serum testing for metals?
So the current standard accepted by conventional medicine is that blood levels blood and urine are accurate measures for heavy metal testing. And they are accurate for acute testing, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that. Where they get this community disagrees is, yeah, that's great, tell us what's in the blood, but it doesn't tell us necessarily what's in the bones, what's in the deep tissue. So, and everybody knows that, for example, there's way more lead in the bone than in the blood, and the kidneys are really good at getting rid of cadmium, but once the kidneys take cadmium out of the blood, it just sticks right there in the kidneys. It's many times higher. Half-life of cadmium in the blood is a couple of days. Half-life cadmium in the kidneys is like 16 years.
So is urine a better way to capture?
Well, there's a better way of doing this with challenge testing. So you give people a chelating agent and collect their urine for several hours and see what happens. And just be clear, it's more accurate, but it has plenty of error in it. I actually did a study where I actually counted the number of fillings in people's mouths, measured their blood levels of mercury, measured the urinary levels of mercury, gave them challenge testing, and just see which correlated best. Because you expect the best test would be the one that correlated with the amount of mercury in their mouth the best. And what I'll tell you is that the only one that correlated very well was the challenge testing. Okay, but our value is like 0.35, so it wasn't very good, but it was better than the blood or the urine or the unchallenged urine.
So we used to do that DMSA. And then collect 6-hour urine. But of course, DMSA now is a prescription.
Right.
So
that's what I've done. I've done that in thousands of people. I give them 500 milligrams of DMSA and 300 milligrams of DMPS orally. The first morning urine tells you the current exposure, given this cocktail, and then collect urine for 6 hours and it tells you what the bile load is. And I found it's worked for me really well over the years. And it's been directly correlates with clinical outcomes as well. Doesn't mean it's a great test. Okay? It doesn't mean it's perfect. It's just the best that seems to be available right now.
But given the difficulty with getting DMSA, especially since most of us, those of us who are not medical doctors, can't write prescriptions. So, what's the second best alternative? And then also,
just do the first morning urine, but just recognize you want to make your standards a little lower. Remember, their standards. Let's not like that lead anymore. I don't know about the other ones exactly. But the way the lead standard was first set was the 95% rule. And that was, if you're within 95% population, your level's fine. If you're in the top 5%, it's toxic. You know what that level was when they said it? It was 60. Okay. So as research became available, we went from 60 to 50 to 40 to 30, and now it's 10, and it's down to 5 for children, and they're considering making it down to 5 for adults. There's no safe level of lead. So just cut your levels down.
Right. And when you
but Ben, you keep asking great questions, but please give other people a chance to talk. I want to hear what people think of what I'm saying.
What about rice, doctor? A lot of the world consumes a lot of rice, yes. And with the brown rice versus the hole around it, causing with the arsenic ingestion.
Yeah, so if you look at the research on rice consumption, people who consume rice have about twice as much arsenic as people who don't. Now, the good news is that if you wash it properly, there's techniques you can look for on the internet. If you wash it, you can actually get rid of, you just cook for like a minute and then throw out the water and start cooking again. You can get rid of it, the majority of the arsenic that way. So there's techniques available on the internet.
Thank you.
Good one. Thank you.
There's a lot of arsenic in the water in Sedona, Arizona, we discovered. So we put a whole house water filter on our second house there.
Smart. Very smart.
Besides arsenic, what's the next 1, 2, or 3 minerals or metalloids that are dangerous?
So you catch me at a good time, because just before this lecture, I was finishing my lecture for Australia, where my lecture this year for them is going to be the 4 worst metal toxins. So if you look at the EPA, they have a center there that looks at what are the worst toxins in the country, and they list them in order. And 4 of the top 7 are metals. Arsenic, number 1. Lead, mercury, and cadmium. So those things by themselves, the chemical toxins are a problem too, no question about that. But those 4 by themselves are causing the most majority of disease in the country, near as I can tell. By the way, that's the first time I've said that. Maybe because I just finished reviewing all the research, and what I'm finding was stunning. Okay, for example, herpes zoster, shingles. Did you know there's a direct correlation with the probability of getting shingles in the level of arsenic in a person's body?
Oh, wow.
I had never seen that before. Anyway, so I'm just finding this correlation after correlation. Heart disease, 15% of MIs, according to one study I literally read this morning, 15% of MIs are from arsenic.
What's an MI?
And by the way, and 1/3 are from lead. Okay, so right there, half of your MIs, the MIs that kill people, half of them are from arsenic and lead, as near as I can tell from the research. Now, maybe I'm wrong a little bit, but I'll tell you not by much, because I'm not making the numbers up. I'm just looking at those 2 studies, and that study says 15%, and that study says 33%. Pretty easy to add it up.
So somebody asked about hair mineral analysis for heavy metals. What about hair versus urine versus serum?
So the hair ought to be good. There's a couple of problems with it. Number one is some people have a big problem getting rid of methyl mercury. And the primary way the body gets rid of methyl mercury is through the hair. So some people, and apparently, I haven't studied the research deeply, so I'm just repeating what I've heard from people I trust. So apparently in autism, one of the things that happens with these kids is they have trouble getting rid of mercury. So it doesn't show up in their hair. My own experience with it is I don't use it as my primary diagnostic tool, but I find it useful to monitor what's happening. So and that's why I really like GTT, because with GTT, you can just monitor how well it's going. Maybe it's not perfect measure of what exactly is happening, but it's a good measure of kind of the total picture. And you want the total picture to improve. So I'm actually kind of happy myself. So when I first was aware of this research on GTT, I was testing on people in Canada. Well, I did it on myself too. And mine was 27. Now at the time I thought, well, 27 is fine. But then as I looked more and more research, I realized, it's actually higher than I want it to be. So I started getting more serious about avoiding toxins. And I did it again 3 years ago. I was down to 26. And I just did a couple of months ago. I was down to 17. So that tells me that all this effort I'm going to in terms of avoiding these toxins, it's working. It's showing up in my blood work. It's got to be good for me.
What does GDT stand for?
Gamma glutamyl transfer peptidase. Okay, I may have missed one of the symbols there, syllables there somewhere.
That'd be great if you could spell that out as far, or type it in the chat so we could research that.
May I say, just go to the internet and just put in GTTP?
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Somebody asked if you could report what you think is the upper limit for the GGT.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I've been trying to figure that out. Right now, my guess is between 15 and 20. Because I don't think I want it too low, because that would imply to me your body's not able to get the job done. Mm-hmm. And I see the disease correlations all start around 20. So I'm thinking between 15 and 20, but that might change as more research becomes available.
By the way, since we're talking about liver enzymes, what do you think is the optimal level for ALT and AST?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that yet. Okay. But yes, both ALT and AST are useful, not as good as GTTP. It's definitely more reactive, but they are useful. Also, uric acid, uric acid goes up with PFAS exposure. The perfluorinates.
So I'm assuming there's probably a high likelihood that there's going to be a correlation with non-alcoholic fatty liver as well and toxins, right?
Plenty. I mean, so again, I've been in medicine now for literally over 50 years. So I'm seeing diseases now we never saw before. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, we never saw that before. ADHD, we never saw that before. I mean, there's all these diseases we're having, we never saw them before. You all know about that. I mean, everybody knows now about type 2 diabetes in children, but for people like me, there's all this disease we didn't have before. Okay, so anybody want to say anything, or anybody want to ask a question? Where would you like to go from here?
Yeah, exactly. What does the minerals, these toxic minerals, do in the body that causes the disease? I missed that.
Great question. So there are a number of ways in which they cause trouble, and it kind of depends upon which particular one. So we look at arsenic, for example, it directly damages DNA, and it poisons the beta cells in the pancreas, so the pancreas can't produce insulin as easily, and it poisons some of the cells signaling mechanisms that the body uses, the cells use to tell it wants to let sugar into the cells. So arsenic correlation, about 25% of diabetes, as near as I can tell, maybe as low as 20%, but that's the rate, 20-25% of diabetes is due to arsenic. And those look like the three primary mechanisms.
And what about the relation to cancer incidence?
Yeah. So that one, what I'm aware of at this point is the DNA damage. That's very clear. But as I've studied cancer more thoroughly, and I'm actually working with a study group right now, really looking at all the natural medicines for cancer. As I study it more thoroughly, more and more, it's the mitochondria. It's the mitochondria they're screwing up more than it's the DNA. And not that the DNA is not important, but there's something, it may just be the mitochondrial DNA damage is the one that's most important. But there's something pretty important there yet. And I don't know how arsenic fits into that. I would not be surprised. I would bet you that's exactly where the arsenic causing trouble. I just haven't seen that research yet.
So what are the best ways to reduce arsenic? What would be your recommendations?
Avoidance.
So how do we avoid it?
So you can get a filter in your house. And so a whole house filter is the best way to do it. If you can't do that, you can filter from your drinking and cooking water. There's a product called Zero Water. I have no commercial relationship with them. I found out about them because I was visiting some friends of mine in the mountains, have a cabin in the mountains, and I always just really dislike the taste of their water. And they both got cancer, by the way, interestingly. And they got this filter called Zero Water, and all the bad taste was gone. So I went looking into research, and sure enough, it gets rid of everything, including arsenic.
Good to know.
What about reverse osmosis?
Yep. Reverse osmosis works. Carbon block filters will get rid of some of it, but not all of it. I don't recommend it because I don't think it gets rid of enough of it. Reverse osmosis works. There's ion exchange that works as well.
How about Berkey water filters?
In this particular study, they did not get rid of the arsenic. Now, maybe they fixed something since then, I don't know, but this particular study, Zero Water was the only one of the 8 that they tested actually got rid of the arsenic. And not surprising because arsenic is hard to get rid of.
So we don't know if bottled water in restaurants, for example, is any better, right? You don't have the research.
No idea. I haven't looked at that. An interesting question, though.
So and it depends on where the bottler got the water from.
Exactly.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So somebody asked, what might you see clinically? What would be some of the clinical signs and symptoms you might see if the person has high arsenic?
See, that's the big challenge. It's not obvious. But looking back at my practice, I'm really pissed off because I remember seeing some patients who had it. So one of the early signs is some pigmentation inexplicable pigmentation on the hands. Okay. I've had patients come to me with that, not knowing why.
What kind of pigmentation?
It's kind of a brownish pigmentation. It looks like a really early sign of excess arsenic. Now, everybody knows about the really severe ones because you didn't get peripheral neuropathy and such. And you get this really peripheral rash. But just these brownish, unexpected discolorations on the palms of the hands had a really strong correlation with arsenic. Kind of interesting. So, what I say is just, I wrote an editorial in IMCJ about 3 years ago where I recommended that the standard of care for all primary care practice, everybody should have their blood measured for lead and everybody should have their urine measured for arsenic.
Now rice tends to be high in arsenic. Do you have any recommendations with regard to that?
Right. So wash the rice. Pure and simple. You got to wash it. You got to wash the arsenic off.
Will it wash off?
Yes, most of it will wash off. There's a protocol on the internet with research supporting that. As I recall, you cook it for like a minute, throw away the water, and cook again the rest of the normal amount of time.
Huh. Interesting.
Now you have to realize, probably not only throwing away the arsenic. Remember, if there's any other soluble minerals on that skin, they're going to go too.
Right. So besides avoiding ingesting arsenic, how do we get rid of arsenic from our bodies? What's your favorite arsenic detox?
The way the body does it is through methylation. Okay. So support methylation. That speeds it up. So for example, if you have somebody who has high homocysteine levels, well, guess what? They're going to be more susceptible to arsenic toxicity. Okay. So get the methylation going well. So avoidance is what you got to do. Make sure methylation is working well. N-acetylcysteine will help decrease some of the inflammatory activity. But those two things all I get to do. Just stop the exposure, just get what's left out.
Is that the same recommendation you would make for other heavy metals like mercury?
No. So remember, half-life of arsenic is only 2 to 4 days.
Okay.
Now, mercury, depends upon your read, it's 30 to 90 days. Lead, about 2 years in the blood, about 7 years in the bone. Cadmium, a few days in the blood, 16 years half-life in the bone and the kidneys. So you got to work to get rid of those things.
Okay. So what would be your recommendations for patients who have high levels of mercury or lead?
So there's two things. One is you want to promote the competing minerals. Okay, so lead goes after calcium, for example. Mercury goes after selenium, for example. So you want to just look at what are the competing minerals and make sure they're at high levels. And then you want to make sure that they're stopping their exposure. And then if you want to get aggressive at it, what I use is fiber plus DMSA. Oral DMSA, I do 250 milligrams every third night. And it's really good at getting rid of the lead and mercury. Use a lot of people now. It works great.
What about binders?
So I think there's other binders that should be usable, but when I started looking for the research on them, it's hard to find. I just looked at a study on chlorella and mercury in mice. Okay, and that was pretty impressive. But they're giving them like 5% of their dietary consumption was chlorella. I don't think our patients want to consume 5% chlorella.
Mm-hmm.
But other popular binders include activated charcoal, zeolite, modified citrus pectin. What do you think about some of these other binders?
So here's the key factor. Our bodies, our smart bodies, secrete 1% of the bile load of mercury into the gut through the bile gut, through the liver every day. But then through intrahepatic recirculation, we absorb 99% what we just dumped. Okay, so why would our smart bodies do something so stupid? Well, because those systems evolved when we were consuming 150 grams of fiber a day. Now we consume 15 to 20 grams of fiber a day. Not enough fiber there to buy into crap that we're dumping into the stools. So I would expect virtually any kind of fiber is going to help. Okay. Now it's not, of course, some will be more effective than others, certain kinds of minerals and such. But, I find getting lost in the minutia not that critical. The big factor is people need to eat more fiber, and the fiber should come from the diet. Pills are great, for sure. Should come from the diet. Remember, those foods rich in fiber have all these other flavonoids and things that protect our bodies from damage.
Yeah.
You mentioned NAC. What would be the dosage for NAC, and what about liposomal glutathione instead of NAC?
Right. So the NAC, about 500 milligrams of NAC will increase red blood cell glutathione by about 30%. Okay. So that does work. Now, we do have some people who have trouble converting cysteine into glutathione, and they're going to be people who are very susceptible to environmental toxins. So those people given things like liposomal glutathione, where it's already preformed, it's a good idea.
But if you're going to use NAC, would you recommend 500 milligrams 3 times a day or once a day or more than that?
As part of my healthy aging strategy, I take 500 milligrams of NAC every night.
That's right. What about somebody with heavy metal toxicity?
Right. So you can increase it.
It's got glutathione.
There's some long-term.
The antioxidant helps detox.
We saw me turn off the microphone. There's long-term research on NAC. It's particularly used in people with cystic fibrosis. So the typical dose is 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams a day, and there have been multi-year studies. They don't seem to have trouble. Now, having said that, I have seen some patients who have sulfur metabolism problems we give them NAC plus DMSA. Okay. It probably was easy to recognize them because I did it to myself. So even though I was taking very reasonable dosages, my body's always had trouble metabolizing sulfur compounds. So for example, garlic makes me sick. Now, I'm an Italian naturopath. Garlic makes me sick. Okay. So I have a lot of trouble metabolizing sulfur compounds. So I overloaded myself by taking too much NAC and DMSA. That won't happen very often, but you have to be aware of it when it does happen. And by the way, taking molybdenum, which is a trace mineral required for those enzymes to work better, will help. So I've been taking molybdenum, and after taking molybdenum for about a year, I noticed I'm not as susceptible to sulfur overload.
Okay. What about strategies to stimulate bile flow, since a lot of these toxins end up in the bile before they get excreted, such as bitter herbs?
Right, Sonara and things like that. So let me be very honest. I'm aware of the research of those herbs for increasing cholesterol excretion. I'm not aware of the research of increasing environmental toxins. Now, most anything that increases excretion of cholesterol should get rid of those toxins as well. But I haven't seen research that says that, so I don't know if it's true. It ought to be, but I don't know.
What about infrared sauna for?
Right. So the best I can tell from sauna is from talking to Dr. Stephen Generous, who's brilliant in this area, what counts as sweating. So whether it's infrared sauna, Swedish sauna, running, doesn't matter what it is, you just got to be sweating. You got to be taking the sweating away from the body. And the research is clear, sweat's full of toxins. And what was so amazing about the research he did is he showed that there's toxins in the sweat that aren't even in the blood or the urine. The body, they're so hard for the body to get rid of, they just stuff them into the sweat. It helps it just stay there and not cause too much trouble.
Now, what about environmental toxins other than metals? What do you think is some of the most significant ones that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, the big one I'm concerned about right now are the bisphenols. So you see all this touting about bisphenol A free, good idea. But what they've done is they just substitute the other bisphenols. So bisphenol S, bisphenol F, bisphenol AF, and bisphenol Z, the ones I've seen written about the most. Well, they're just as toxic. Okay, they just have different levels of different kinds of toxicity, and particularly bisphenol S. If you have a male who's infertile, you better look at his bisphenol S levels, because it turns out there's a pretty strong correlation with bisphenol S levels and male infertility.
Wow, is bisphenol S actually measured? Is that in any of the panels?
No, that's the frustrating part. We're putting pressure on the labs to measure all the bisphenols, but they have not been able to do so far. I don't know why. Now, I've got a suspicion. My suspicion is that the plastic tubing in their equipment is probably contaminated. Now, this is total speculation on my part, but my background happens to be analytical chemistry. So I'm thinking, why aren't they analyzing that? Because I could see how you do it. I said, I bet their equipment is contaminated already.
Interesting.
So we'll see what happens. And I did not accuse them of that, everybody. I'm just speculating, why might that be happening? Maybe the problem is it's overlapping with another molecule and makes it too hard to differentiate. I don't know.
Dr. Rabar, who's on the line, he does a lot of testing with for environmental toxins through Vibrant America. Sam, do you know, do they include bisphenol S? Okay. Well, At least he was on the call.
By the way, if you find somebody who's doing those other bisphenols, please let us know, because the environmental medicine community really wants them.
Right. We started using Vibrant America. They have a really good combination. They offer if you can do an environmental toxins, heavy metal toxins, and mycotoxins.
Yes.
And they'll do all three of those panels for $400.
Okay, somebody said, let's hear about the new book. And have you come back, please? Oh, thank you. It erased before I saw the rest of it. Okay, so my wife, Laura, has been quite an instruction for me in many ways, of course. All men know about that. But anyway, so every woman in her family died from complications of osteoporosis. Okay, so we assumed that since we were living so much more healthfully than all the rest of them, that she would not have a problem. So in her early 40s, there was a inexpensive test available being shown at one of the conventions that showed bone ankle density. So we looked at it, she was osteopenic. We were so surprised. So then we went and got a more sophisticated DEXA test, and sure enough, she was osteopenic. And so we said, okay, we better start doing something about that. So at that point, I applied my body of knowledge on what to do about it, and she kept losing bone. Now remember, this was a while ago. And so at that point, I thought I was being really brave, giving her 1,500 units of vitamin D a day. Okay, but none of the things I was doing, giving her 2,000 units of milligrams of calcium. We made sure her hormones were balanced properly. We did everything we could think of. And then at one convention, there was the first testing available for DNA SNPs related to the VDR receptor sites. So it turns out Laura had every abnormal VDR receptor site that they had tests for. So it turns out that in order to get her vitamin D levels up to where they really needed to be, she had to take 14,000 units of vitamin D a day for 2 years before we got her vitamin D levels up. So we had her DEXAs down. Vitamin D receptor sites, she leveled it out and started going back up. And then when she was doing some research about what else she could do, she ran across a company called Algical. So pardon me, I'm not paid by them, but Laura is. She's our science writer. Anyway, so she found this company, and she said, well, I like the idea of all these trace minerals that you get in Algical. She started taking that product, and she was going up, and then she shot up. And now, 30 years later, Laura has normal bones. She now does not have osteoporosis and dying like her mother and her grandmother did, but she doesn't have osteopenia anymore. And so basically, that book is about her journey about figuring this out. Now, the interesting thing for me was that whenever Laura would find some biochemical pathway that was important for bone health, I'd say, that biochemical pathway is important for the kidneys, or that one's important for the heart, or that one's important for the brain. I was realizing everything necessary for the bones to work healthfully is necessary for the whole body, which is why we end up naming it Healthy Bones, Healthy You, because it's true. If you do what's necessary for the bones, everything else starts working working better, I should say.
Ask him about that.
I hate to ask a question off the subject at the moment, but do you see any relationship in the data about Parkinson's with any of these toxins?
Oh, of course. Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. So there's two kinds of data I'm looking at. I've seen. Unfortunately, I haven't looked at it deeply enough because I just haven't have had a Parkinson's patient lately, so I just haven't dove into it. And so I saw two patterns. One is a direct correlation between neurotoxic pesticide exposure and Parkinson's, no question about it. So if anybody's living near, I hate to say this, folks, if you're living on a golf course, have your levels checked. That's a little worried. If you do a lot of travel on airplanes, better check your levels. I had some friends of mine who are literally international globetrotters. They had the highest levels of organophosphate pesticides I've seen anywhere. Okay. So now there's another thing, and it turns out if people who, when they're detoxifying the organophosphates, go through phase 1 too fast and phase 2 too slowly, they have an even more toxic reaction to the pesticides. So it looks like there's both the exposure component and a susceptibility component to it. And I haven't finished going through the research to figure that out yet. But there's
why the airplane? I missed the airplanes. Why the airplanes?
Airplanes?
You said flying a lot on airplanes. Why?
Oh, I'm sorry. People flying on airplanes. Well, so I'll tell you this from personal experience. They heavily sprayed those airplanes for arachnoids and rodents and things like that. And particularly when you're flying internationally, like I was flying, those things are always sprayed before they get to locations or when they leave one country to another.
And golf courses for all the pesticides, correct, Doctor?
Yeah, all the pesticides that's being used.
Wow, thank you so much. Gosh.
So, you looks like you're mostly all still here. Do you like these ideas? Am I going wrong in some direction?
Oh, no, absolutely. We're all very aware of the role of toxins, and, we just want more details as to exactly which ones to focus on. How do we
start with arsenic? Seriously, folks. Commercial where get my book, Clinical Environmental Medicine, gets you a lot of information about arsenic. But the good news is, once you detect it, all you got to do is stop the exposure, and the body will take care of it. And one of the things I've noticed in my book for consumers I wrote called The Toxin Solution, I differentiate between persistent toxins and non-persistent toxins. So persistent toxins are those that have really long half-lives. They're hard to get rid of out of the body. Like the perfluorinates, they're like 2 to 4 year half-life to get those things out of the body. So yeah, great, you stop using Teflon stuff, but the stuff, it's still in the body. Takes a while to get rid of it. Okay. Anyway, so you got those persistent ones. The PCBs, half-lives 10 to 20 years. Really hard to get rid of. Lead, long years. Okay. Then you have the non-persistents, the phthalates, arsenic, bisphenol A, things like that, the various kinds of solvents and things like that. Most of them have short half-lives, hours to days. Just stop the exposure, get rid of them. So if you engage your patient to religiously stop their exposure to everything possible, they will feel better within 2 weeks. And that gets them engaged for the months to years long process to get rid of the rest of the junk.
Any clinical pearls for getting rid of lead?
The DMSA is still the best. DMSA is still the best that I know. So actually, DMSA is actually better for lead than it is for mercury. And so what I find with my patients, I see mercury toxicity way more than lead toxicity, but I may have to reconsider that. But anyway, it takes out the lead as well as the mercury. So you see mercury levels go down, the lead levels go down too. Works great. And very, very low adverse events. I only see adverse events for people who are sulfur-sensitive, and that's very, very rare.
Have you found benefits to using EDTA for lead?
I haven't. Jerry Gordon did an interesting job digging up some research showing that 5 grams orally a day of EDTA was good at getting rid of lead from the body. And it was some pretty interesting research. Now, it was on lead-exposed people, so that can skew the research, but it was pretty interesting.
And any clinical pearls about mercury? Because that's a really common one.
So you got to watch what the fish that you eat. The fish, the amount of mercury in the fish is in general proportion to the size of the fish. So the smaller the fish, the better. And also, of course, cold water, since it's higher omega-3s, it's going to be healthier. But you have to eat small fish because there's no question, direct correlation between the amount of fish eaten and not only the amount of mercury in the brain, or actually in the urine and blood, but also deficits in psychomotor tests. Okay, so no question about it. More fish people eat, the more psychoneural test deficits.
But how many people are eating fish in place of other animal proteins because they think it's healthier, and then the fish has plastic? Just
eat smaller wild-caught fish, yes. But it's going to be hard for the world to sustain that. And fortunately, farm fish, not as bad as cows, corn-fed cows, but farm fish is not very good either. And has pretty good toxin. It's got a very high toxic load as well. And
if you eat out at restaurants, there's very few restaurants that serve wild fish. And, there's a lot of restaurants.
Make sure you don't get gypped. Order wild salmon and order farm salmon right next to each other, eat them next to each other, and you know immediately which is which.
Right. I know in LA, a lot of restaurants are selling this Scottish wild salmon, which is actually farmed.
Well, and even if it's wild caught, because the Ireland salmon is so polluted, it pollutes the Scottish salmon as well. So even the salmon wild caught is as bad as the salmon farmed in the U.S.
Well, my understanding is the Scottish salmon that's being sold is all it's in pens in the ocean, and they're saying that it's wild because they're big pens or something like that.
Yeah, well, if they fed them the right food, that's fine. But it turns out the primary driver of the high toxic load in the fish is actually what they're fed.
Right, of course.
I have a question.
Sure.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
I've read a lot about detox baths that use Epsom salts, baking soda, bentonite.
Yes.
Do those do anything?
That's a good question. And I actually have not looked into that research. I am a person who likes soaking in a magnesium bath. I think it's good for me. But I haven't actually looked at the ion exchange with environmental toxins. Good question. Let me look into that.
Okay. Thank you.
What is the toxicity of farmed trout?
Well, again, it depends entirely upon what they're fed. If they're fed healthy food, they're okay. But if they're fed the processed, mass-produced foods, then no, they're not going to be okay.
Right. Any thoughts on charcoal hemofiltration?
It ought to be pretty effective. Okay, but now, I'm not necessarily saying the whole procedure is totally validated, but conceptually, I could see how it could work. That's all I can say at this point.
Somebody asked about homocysteine as a possible marker for arsenic toxicity.
So the thing with homocysteine, as the homocysteine levels go up, and that's an indication of impaired methylation capability. So if you have impaired methylation capability, it makes arsenic more toxic. Because when arsenic is detoxified, it goes through a two-step process. It's first methylated to something called arsenic acid. But anyway, it's called arsenic, 1-methyl arsenic, which is actually way more toxic than inorganic arsenic. Then it goes to a second methylation stage, and a second methyl, which makes it like 400 times less toxic than elemental arsenic. Some people have a fast first phase, sound familiar, and a slow second phase. Okay, and those people actually get toxicity to arsenic more easily. Now, it's only about 1% of the population, as near as I can tell, has that. I'm not sure I'm confident about the genetics yet, but I saw that pattern, and I actually just had a patient with that pattern. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
Somebody asked about homocysteine being too low. As far as I know, the lower the better for homocysteine.
It's a very good question. So I wrote a letter on, I wrote an editorial on homocysteine entitled Homocysteine Friend or Foe about 6 years ago. And I actually looked at that question, and it turns out you can have too low a homocysteine. And when you think about it, we think about homocysteine as being an evil molecule. Remember, the body produces all the homocysteine in the body. It's not an evil molecule. The body has a purpose for it. It only becomes an evil molecule when we screw things up. Okay, so we think about, what does homocysteine do? Well, it's a storage site for cysteine, right? To go into glutathione production as we need it. It transports methyl groups around. Okay, so homocysteine is actually a reusable molecule. So it turns out when you get below around 4, there's some neurological dysfunction that starts showing up. So when I look at homocysteine, I would guess the ideal is probably between 6 and 8 would be my best guess at this point. But that's subject to change as I see more research.
So when you say support methylation, for a lot of people, that just means give methyl B vitamins, end of story. But there's more to it, right?
Yes. So if you had a chance to listen to my lecture on unimportant molecules, there's a fascinating... I have to give an hour and a half lecture tomorrow morning. I made me run out of voice. Okay. One more thing, I think I'm going to have to call it quits.
That's okay. We're honored for you to have joined us this evening.
Oh, you're very kind. Actually, I just forgot your question. Sorry, it's getting late for me. What was your question again?
It was just about like some of the details about how to deal with methylation issues besides simply
thank you.
recommending.
Really important one, right on my soapbox. So everybody's aware of the MTHFR polymorphisms and how that's really unfortunate because folic acid can't be metabolized for these people. So they have higher homocysteine and direct correlations with cancer and heart disease and dementia. I mean, the data is pretty clear. But here's the kicker. There's no folic acid in food, right? You have natural folates. And what are they? They're methylated folates. So they go right into the methylation function with the homocysteine. They don't need MTHFR. So this whole MTHFR bugaboo that we've created it's only because we screw up our diet and lost one of the standard molecules from the diet, which is folates. So good news is have people eat real folates. Could it be one of the reasons why all this research on fermented foods always seems to find a negative correlation with virtually every fermented food and every disease? Well, guess what? Fermented foods have lots of natural folates. So I think when I put people on a diet, not only is it high in arsenic, but now people don't have much folates in their diet. So now we're dependent upon folic acid. And for those who can convert folic acid to the methylated folates, well, okay. A substantial portion of the population doesn't do that very well, if at all. Okay for them. But how about everybody else? Okay. Well, if you eat a natural diet, it doesn't matter. I'm going so much back to the old time ways. Eat real food that's uncontaminated, and your body is remarkable. Things will work out pretty well.
Eat real food.
Eat real food, and make sure it's not contaminated.
Yeah.
Remember, these new to nature molecules and all these halogenated hydrocarbons, we've never seen them before. We don't know what to do with them. They just poison us. And yes, lead and cadmium and mercury were around, but they're buried pretty deep. We didn't get much experience with them. Got some experience with mercury. Okay, so we're fairly good at getting rid of mercury. Remember, we're talking about half-lives in months rather than half-lives in years. And arsenic we came across all the time. So try to avoid that. But without those toxins, our bodies work just great. But with those toxins, they screw things up because our body doesn't know how to deal with them. Remember, and many of them were intentionally designed to be difficult to break down by biological systems. So of course they saturate the environment, saturate us. DDT was banned almost 50 years ago. Every fetus today has DDT in him or her, okay? And that DDT is causing neurological damage. Okay, I got to call quits.
Thank you, Dr. Pizzorno. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody. Look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you for making it all the way through this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star ratings and review. That way more people will be able to find this Rational Wellness Podcast when they're searching for health podcasts. And I wanted to let everybody know that I do now have a few openings for new nutritional consultations for patients at my Santa Monica Weitz Sports Chiropractic and Nutrition Clinic. So if you're interested, please call my office, 310-395-3111, and sign up for one of the few remaining slots for a comprehensive nutritional consultation with Dr. Ben Weitz. Thank you, and see you next week.